if someone was looking for a way to rapidly lose weight, this is something that could be effective. But as I'll especially caution later, there's cost to that. That doesn't mean that this is the best way to lose weight in the long term. It doesn't mean that it's also supporting our health. And in fact, I would argue that it's going to lead us to be much more prone to regaining weight later. But that is a case if you're looking for some sort of a solution to lose weight rapidly, which I would really generally recommend against, it can work for that. The other situation is people who have extreme fitness or physique goals. If you're trying to get quote unquote shredded via shred maxing, or if you're, Mark Bell trying to get to really low single digit body fat percentages, then this can be effective for those scenarios. If we're trying to get below, let's say 8% body fat, then to get to such a level that I would say is physiologically unhealthy in most cases, the vast majority of cases, and inherently comes at a cost to our health, there has to be some pretty stressful interventions in order to get there. And this can be one of them. A lot of times people might try a very low calorie diet. People might try a very low carbohydrate diet. And this can be an alternative there, right? You could do a very low fat and a very low protein diet, try to upregulate FGF21, drive all the stress, and try to get to a very low body fat percentage. I do think it's worth recognizing that very, very, very few people stay at a body fat percentage that low. It's really, I think, more of a transient goal. And it's also one that I would argue is at odds with our health. Despite what we see in, fitness magazines and elsewhere, the vast majority of people who you're seeing at those very low body fat percentages are only there for a very short period of time. And they're doing it at the cost of their health, not in support of their health. So this could be a tool to use in those cases. It's just not really a use case that I tend to come across very often or recommend that people try to orient themselves toward, because I don't think it's healthy really physically, or I think mentally as well in a lot of cases. Obviously there's exceptions to everything, but so that's another use case here. And then just to round it out, as I mentioned, if you're dealing with insulin resistance, reducing the fat can be really helpful here. But as we pointed out, lowering the protein too much is definitely not a requirement. And in the case of someone who has, chronic kidney disease, major kidney dysfunction, that's a case where maybe lowering the protein more is beneficial. But again, it's not because of the FGF21. It's because we basically are in a pathological state where we can't properly process protein. And so we're just not making that any worse, right? We're not trying to put protein into a broken protein metabolizing system. So that would, I think, be my general thoughts as far as how the diets are actually working. But that brings me to some of the concerns with the diets. And I've alluded to a number of these when it comes to FGF21, but that's not the only concern here. There's various other ones relating to the Randle cycle, relating to hormones, relating to digestion, relating to blood sugar stability. So we'll start here just going over those ones that I've mentioned, especially in the last episode when it comes to FGF21. If you are upregulating FGF21, in the cases that we looked at, all the research throughout the last episode, there are side effects. Bone loss, muscle loss, infertility, in the rodent models where they're seeing upregulated FGF21 activity during developmental periods, we see stunted growth. So a number of concerns there. But as I mentioned, even if we're not necessarily seeing those things, because we're working through a stress system, we're upregulating stress in order to try to lose weight and basically create a quote unquote deficit, we're going to have a natural byproduct, which is going to be metabolic suppression in the long term. This is going to be something that will downregulate our metabolic state in the long term. It'll decrease the conversion of T4 to T3. It'll decrease the production of the reproductive steroid hormones. And, we saw infertility in those rodent models as well, supporting that. And is something that will probably lead us to be very prone to weight regain, much like other stress-induced diets, whether it's super low-calorie dieting, maybe induced by Ozempic or some of those other GLP-1 agonists, or whether it's due to a very low-carb diet or due to just massive over-exercising. Those things work until they don't. And I mean, that's the vast majority of clients and people in my programs who I'm seeing are at that point where it's not working anymore. And if you're not at that point, I think it's really important to try not to do things that will get you to that point. If we're looking for, and if you're already at that point, you definitely don't want to be going back on that wagon, back on that weight loss cycling where you're going to be more prone to regaining weight and it's harder and harder to lose the weight every time. And it comes with worse and worse health side effects, essentially, energy and hair, skin, and nails and libido and poor sleep and anxiety and all of the rest that we tend to see from that chronic stress. So that's a couple of concerns here. Another one is that when we're dramatically increasing the metabolic rate with something like FGF21 versus just creating a calorie deficit, let's say, one of the concerns here is we're running through a lot of fuel, which increases our nutrient needs. And especially if we're on more of a sugar or honey-based diet as opposed to a fruit-based diet, we're going to be much more likely to get nutrient deficiencies due to the fact that we're burning through all this fuel at a very high rate and we're not eating a particularly nutrient-dense diet, especially if we're also keeping protein out of the diet, because our protein sources tend to be our most nutrient-dense sources, or at least equivalent with a lot of the carb sources. So if we're on a sugar or honey-based low-protein diet, we're upregulating our need for nutrients, and we're probably not getting enough. We're probably seeing major gaps in our nutrients. And so that's another concern here when it comes to specifically the upregulation of FGF21 and these sorts of diets. And again, as I mentioned, this is not so different from the bodybuilders using ephedrine or high-dose T3 or caffeine in order to lose body fat. You're causing a very, very similar state, except at least with those things, you can eat enough protein. So you can still eat more protein in those states to prevent the bone loss, the lean mass loss, the muscle loss, and some of those other effects. So I think it could even be argued that that would be a better route to go, despite all of the negatives that come in both states. Now, there are some other ways that this diet can cause stress. So you might be saying, if I'm not getting enough protein, I'll lose lean mass, possibly, but I'm getting a lot of protein with dinner because I have all my protein fat with dinner and not earlier in the day, so I should be covered there. The reality is, for one, just by upregulating FGF21 earlier in the day, you're going to be decreasing protein synthesis. And I wouldn't be so confident in the fact that, especially when we don't have anything substantial or any evidence to support, that an increase in protein synthesis later will outweigh that. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing is having a dinner of just protein and fat without any carbs is inherently stressful in and of itself. And I've talked about this. We've talked about this on previous Energy Balance podcast episodes, talking about blood sugar regulation. But basically, eating protein plus fat alone without the carbs, it'll drive blood sugar down because the insulinogenic effect of the protein causes low blood sugar, which then drives glucagon up to produce carbohydrate through gluconeogenesis in order to keep your blood sugar maintained. But we know that glucagon is an anti-metabolic hormone. It drives the same stress. It's a major part of the stress cascade, and it decreases the conversion of T4 to T3 and shifts us into more fat burning, more fat oxidation, more lipolysis, which helps us deal with the stress in the short term, but in the long term has those same anti-metabolic effects. Now, the other aspect of this that you may or may not be experiencing now, but something to be aware of, is that this can also directly interfere with sleep, because the glucagon itself is stress. It's a part of the stress cascade and makes it basically puts us into a stress state where it makes it a lot harder to relax and sleep effectively. And again, you might be having benefits in terms of your sleep due to the other things I've mentioned, like keeping a lot of the bad foods out and maybe improving insulin sensitivity. There might be a net positive there, but I would be concerned, especially over time, with the protein and fat dinner interfering with sleep. And it's something I see really often, excess protein, especially later in the day before bed, causing either waking up throughout the night or trouble falling asleep. So that's one to consider. But another way that we might be creating stress on this diet is from the blood sugar stability standpoint. When we're only eating carbohydrates earlier in the day, especially really quick digesting ones like juice and sugar and candy and honey, and without protein and fat, we digest those sugars very quickly. And at the same time, when we don't have some amount of fat coming in, it means that we're basically forcing our whole bodies to run on glucose. We'll come back to this in a moment with the Randle cycle, but in terms of stress, what this means is that because glucose is utilized much quicker than fat, and you have your whole body running on glucose, your muscles and organ systems, and of course, brain and everything, you're going to be having major rushes in of carbohydrates when you're consuming, like major rushes into the bloodstream, and then major depletion very quickly of those carbohydrates because your whole body is using those very quickly. Whereas if you had some protein to use, you would run through that fuel a little less quickly. But because we're running through it so fast, we're going to be generally seeing a lot more ups and downs with the blood sugar. Now, I'm not saying that blood sugar spikes, within a certain range are problematic or cause insulin resistance or anything like that. But what I am saying is that typically this leads to a state where we have to eat very frequently, especially if we're eating low fiber fruits as well, or low fiber carbohydrates. We tend to run through those really quickly, and we tend to need to eat very consistently to try to keep our blood sugar stable. And even then, it can be a challenge to keep the blood sugar stable. And then the other piece as well is that things like fiber, protein, and fat slow the digestion of the carbohydrates. So not only do we have a potential situation where, and we'll get to this in a moment, but where the muscles could be using fat, and so we're not running through the glucose so much, we're not using up all that glucose that the brain and nervous system need, and some of the other important organ systems need, and therefore running through it really, too quickly. But not only is there that aspect, but because when we have fat and protein and fiber as well with carbohydrates, we digest them slower, and so we get a slower rise in the blood sugar, which leads to a stable and more steady blood sugar throughout the day. So we don't have to be eating constantly every hour or something like that, but instead we can have, a more comfortable space between our meals. If you enjoyed that clip, you'll definitely want to download the free Energy Balance Food Guide. The Energy Balance Food Guide will help you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy, and so much more. The food guide makes it extremely easy to get started with a bioenergetic approach to optimizing your health. So head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide.